Good morning. Thanks for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's great to see a full house here today. Welcome to this child maltreatment presentation. My name is Kate Beyer-Walter. I'm a full-time faculty member of the psychology department here at GRCC. And our presentation today is sponsored by the psych department and also Family Futures of Grand Rapids. We are pleased to have our panel of experts here to share with you their thoughts, and I'd like to introduce them to you. Dr. Mary DeYoung joins us from the faculty of Grand Valley State University, where she teaches a course on child maltreatment. Jen Schmidt is a licensed social worker and supervisor for Child Protective Services of Kent County. Dr. Jeff Kelsch is a forensic psychologist and an adjunct faculty member here at GRCC. And Sue Toman is Chief Operating Officer for Family Futures, the co-sponsor of this event. I'd also like to recognize Leslie Christian here in the front row. She is a CASA volunteer, and she will be available for you after the presentation at the back. She has a table, and we have some information for you. I'd also like to thank Lucy Joswick and Renelle Mingori from Family Futures for all their hard work to put this event together. I do have a few logistical things to share with you before we begin. The format today is going to consist of short presentations by each of our panelists, followed by a question and answer period. And I think it will work best if you just hold your questions until all of the panelists have had a chance to share. And then at that time, we'll have questions, and I will come around with the microphone. Because we are recording, we'd like to have you speak into the microphone with your questions. Please do me a favor and silence your cell phones. Better yet, just put them away altogether so you can really focus on the material that's been prepared for you today. Would really appreciate that. Some of you are here for extra credit. We have signed slips of paper for you that we will hand out as you leave by the back door today. We'll have a slip of paper that you can take and give to your professor. Some of you have signed papers already. If you hand those to me, I'll let your professor know as well. So thank you. If you need to leave early, please do so quietly, and you'll need to work something out with your professor then if you have to leave early. Lastly, I'd just like to say I know that there are survivors of child maltreatment sitting in our audience today, and I know that for some of you, it's really hard to be here. And I want to commend you for being here and thank you for being here, and I hope that you find the information valuable to you. I also have a little something for you if you are a survivor of child maltreatment. At the end, if you would just pick up this little token, it says I'm a survivor, and it has the symbol for strength and free candy. So please take that just as a small token of thanks for your being here. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So Mary, can you lead us off?
It's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you very briefly about child maltreatment. I've been asked to address some very particular things, the importance of the topic, and I think the number of people who are here today and the various reasons that you've come here, quite aside from the fact that you're getting extra credit, some of you, really is testimony to the importance of the topic in and of itself, but I'll expand on that for a moment. And I've also been asked to speak a little bit about neglect. Very often when we talk about child abuse and neglect, what we really talk about is child abuse. Neglect gets neglected in a lot of discussions, and I'd like to briefly comment on that in just a few minutes. But let me start talking about importance for a minute. As a sociologist, I treat child abuse and neglect as being a social problem among many other kinds of problems. And we all know that social problems have certain dimensions associated with them, very practical kinds of measures, if you will, of the nature of the problem and the impact that it's having on society. We know that approximately 3 million children are reported for child abuse and neglect to formal reporting agencies, what we call in Michigan Children's Protective Services, every year in this country, 3 million children. We also know that the cost of child abuse and neglect is really quite staggering, although somewhat hidden perhaps from public view. It's estimated, and my figures here are from 2008 because I've not found anything more recent on it, that it costs us conservatively $124 billion a year. If you want to add to that lost productivity over a lifetime for someone who has had the experience of child maltreatment, we may be talking about $500 billion a year. So this is an expensive proposition we're talking about, an expensive problem that we have to deal with. So that's a practical dimension. Then we can think of other dimensions as well. There is a moral and an ideological one. We are, after all, talking about children. Children are in a state of dependency. They rely upon their parents. They rely upon adults to take care of them. And so the cost of child abuse in that kind of way, in the rupture of trust, in the difficulties that we have in a kind of social contract to take care of the most dependent, are really considerable as well. There are political reasons to think about child abuse as a problem. How do we distribute resources in this country? How do we help families raise their children? How do we provide the resources that families need to take care of their children speaks volumes about our political system, our values that underlie political decisions as well. And then, of course, there are individual reasons for why child abuse and neglect is so important. And many of you may have come here today for your own personal reason. It was an experience you had or someone you love had, and you're really wanting to work through and engage and interrogate what that experience is all about. Whatever brings you here is an individual reason, and I'm not going to privilege one kind of reason over another in making my claim that child abuse is a very important social problem that all of us really need to address. But there is something very ironic about child abuse, nonetheless. For as big of a problem as it is, and as encompassing as it is, there is a lot of misinformation and myths that circulate about child abuse. And part of that is because there are so many voices talking about child abuse. It doesn't belong to any one particular discipline, or for that matter, any one particular profession. I'm a sociologist, so the child maltreatment course we teach at Grand Valley is out of the sociology department. In your future studies, you may very well come across a child abuse course that's being taught out of psychology or out of public health or social work or a variety of other disciplines. And then on top of that, of course, we have much of the experience of child abuse and neglect being mediated to us by the media, which is a very good generator at times of false information and mythical information about the nature of the problem. So we have a lot of myths that are floating around. We have a lot of numbers that get repeated all of the time, and then pretty soon they start to sound true because everybody's saying them, but they're not necessarily based on anything factual at all. And we have a lot of ideas as well about what kinds of people do this to their children. And a lot of these ideas are indeed very mythical. And rather than destroying the myth and kind of taking it apart, what I'd really like to focus on just for a second is the issue of myth-making itself, why it is that we kind of create these myths. The first day of my child maltreatment class, I say to my students, how many of you believe, and you don't have to defend your position, How many of you believe that anybody who abuses a child is sick? And I use that really spongy word sick, right? Because you can read into that anything you want. Probably 90% of all students immediately raise their hands. How many of you believe that people who abuse their children are evil? Now we'll use a moral term. Well, they're a little bit more hesitant to do that in a sociology class, I think, but usually I get about half of the students who end up raising their hand. How many of you believe that once a child is abused, the child will never, ever fully restore and be a functioning human being again? Probably half or more of all students. Now, you may be interested to know that those three things that I've said to you, which I didn't ask you to raise your own hands, but hopefully in your mind you're thinking about this, as I'm talking here, are really much more mythical than they are anything else. But these are ideas that get circulated over and over again. And so as a sociologist, I always want to ask, why are we developing myths about a problem that should stir us, and usually does, when we hear about cases of it? And so I'd like to just give you a little sociological argument here, and there's no extra cost to you for listening to this at all, and there won't be a quiz. And basically what myth-making is all about is a way for us to engage with a problem on our own terms and at our own convenience. So we can deal with child abuse when we want to, maybe when we read about a case in the paper, or hear something on the media, or we know about a case within our own social network or our families. We can engage if we want to, but we don't have to engage all the time. And not doing it all of the time really relies upon some myths that the people who do these kinds of things are people who are fundamentally different from you and me. And therefore, we can keep them at a distance. We can judge and we can evaluate, but there isn't very much of a burden on us to try and understand. And I think one of the things that forums like this do, which is really very lovely, is ask us to really understand, not to approach the topic from a distance, but to engage with it. One of the myths, I think, also that very much floats around in the area of child maltreatment has to do with neglect. If you were to get a dozen textbooks on child abuse and neglect, you would see that there was probably in each one of them one chapter, and rather a small chapter at that, on neglect. Neglect is very much neglected. And so I want to just talk in conclusion and very quickly about the issue of neglect for a moment, this neglected feature of child maltreatment. Why is it neglected? Probably for two reasons, I think, two very big reasons. And oh, by the way, I should preface my remarks by telling you that of the 3 million reports of child abuse and neglect that come into CPS every year on a national level, 2/3 of those, 66%, are for neglect. You may be surprised about that because we talk a whole lot more about physical abuse and sexual abuse than we talk about neglect. So it really is a feature of our overlooking a very important feature of what child maltreatment is all about. So two reasons, I think, why it's neglected. It has a very expansive definition. It covers everything from medical neglect to supervisory to shelter issues to hygiene issues, a whole variety of different kinds of things incorporated under it. And I think really most significantly, neglect is very much tied up with social problems other than child abuse and neglect itself. To deal with neglect is to deal with poverty. It's to deal with the issue of affordable housing, access to health care, unemployment, all of those things that are very political, very social in nature, and complicating as a result of their influence on neglect, a very intimate relationship with that. Let me just conclude by saying this to you. You know, so often sociologists get criticized for telling us where all the problems are and how awful all the problems are, and then walking away without saying anything about a solution, about any way to redress the problem. I wish that I had a solution to child abuse and neglect. I wish I could make it go away. I can't. But I want to tell you what I think will empower you in some ways in the face of this very large social problem. Act locally. We have lots and lots of programs in West Michigan that you can become volunteers with, that you can contribute to in some kind of substantive ways, that are working really hard to deal with families, to deal with child maltreatment, the quality of life under which kids in our community are being raised. You'll have an incredible sense of empowerment doing that. And it may not be the dramatic rescue of the abused child that all of us kind of have a fantasy about doing and think would be the most satisfying for us. But in many ways, in the long term, it's going to have a much more profound effect on the quality of life for kids. So thank you very much for inviting me here. I hope to answer any questions you have after our presentation, and I wish you all the best.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks again for being here, and I appreciate GRCC asking me to be here to take part in this panel as well. I am a CPS supervisor. I've also been a CPS investigator. I've worked in foster care and adoption. So child welfare is something that's near and dear to my heart. I've worked in it for 17 years now, so and run kind of the gamut of beginning to end of how the process can work. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about reporting child abuse and neglect, how to do that, when to do that, and then what happens kind of once you do that, what happens with the investigation and how the case proceeds. So to start with, before we get to how to report, I want to talk a little bit about circumstances that may come up which you want to report or that may raise the question for you. That's usually going to happen if you see something happen or somebody tells you something. So those are kind of the two different points of view that we get. If you see something happen or you see something that's concerning, that could be seeing a parent discipline their child or seeing a child who does not seem to have any parental supervision with them, or being in a home for any reason that seems to be unsafe or neglectful because of the conditions of the home or lack of heat in the home or lack of food in the home. Those are all things that you can report. The other side is if someone tells you something happened, and that can be secondhand, just someone else saying, I was in this home and it was filthy and disgusting and dirty. You can call that in. You don't have to have seen it yourself. You can share with them when you call it in that this was told to you by another party. That's fine too. We just want to make sure the information gets to us. In addition, somebody may tell you something, a child may disclose to you. They may tell you that something is happening to them at home, or that something has happened to them at home. I want to focus on that for just a minute because those are some very emotional and critical times for children to disclose that. So I want to talk a little bit about how we respond to that when a child makes a disclosure to you. So first of all, just believe them. That's your first reaction. It's not your job to investigate it. You don't have to feel as though you have to investigate it. You don't need to make sure that it's true before you call CPS. Just listen to what they have to say. Don't overreact. Try not to have a huge emotional reaction to it. Some of the things that children may disclose to you at some point may be really difficult to hear. But you want to try to just listen. Keep your body language calm. Keep your voice calm. We want to keep the child's anxiety level down. So if they tell you something and your reaction is, oh my God, what? They are going to stop telling you because sometimes they don't even realize what's happening is necessarily all that wrong. So they may tell you a disclosure in a way that is just normal conversation because that is all they have ever known. They don't even realize that what's happening is wrong. So just be aware to keep their anxiety level down. Don't push them to say more than what they're comfortable saying. You can reassure them that what happened isn't their fault if you feel like that's reasonable. But mostly just stay calm and listen, and then make your report to CPS if you feel like you need to do that. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that because sometimes that's a really difficult part of this process that people don't focus on is is your own reaction when kids disclose something to you. So if you do need to make a report, I don't know how many people know this, but up until March of this year, every county had their own intake department. So if there was child abuse or neglect happening in Kent County, you called a number in Kent County and it went through Kent County's process. That, as of March, has changed. There is one intake department now for the entire state of Michigan, including Detroit and the UP, which sometimes we want to pretend we don't. You know, they're not part of us, but but they are. So there's now one number. That office for that central intake is actually located in Kent County. So we have had the privilege of being very closely involved with the startup of that process. So that's actually helpful because now there's one number. You don't need to try to seek it out if you are visiting somebody in Lansing or you're at a Red Wings game in Detroit. It's all the same number, no matter where you see it or what happens. So there are cards in the back. There's a box of cards in the back that have that number on it. That number is, for anyone who wants it right now, is 855-444-3911. You can find it just about anywhere. I don't know how updated. Everyone's on their phones now, so I'm sure if you looked on DHS's website, you can find it. You can always call 211. They will always be able to give you the number for that. So that's the number you call. There are some situations where we have mandated reporters. Some of you, depending on your job or role in a certain situation, may be a mandated reporter. I'm not going to go into that because that's an entire training by itself. But just know that if you're a daycare provider, a medical personnel, a social worker, a therapist, you may be a mandated reporter, but you will be well aware of that by the point that you become a mandated reporter. Anybody can report to CPS. Anybody. You don't have to be a mandated reporter. You don't have to be a relative to the family. You don't even have to necessarily know their name. If you see something or have a concern about something, call. We would ask that you try to make some efforts to get some information if that's possible. Sometimes that can be as simple as getting a license plate number. We get a lot of calls from somebody who saw something happen in Meyer or at Subway because someone left their car or their child in the car while they were in Subway or picking something up or running into the store or running into the mall. We get a lot of calls like that. If you can get the license plate number of the car, we can use that. That's good enough. If it's a situation where you're calling about a person, the more information you can give us, the better. If we don't have any information, we may not be able to do anything at all because we don't know where to find them. But if you can get us the name, even the name of the child, a date of birth or an age of the child, where they live is helpful, or even who they live with, a name of a parent, a name of who the alleged perpetrator is, who actually abused them, where that abuse may have taken place. Sometimes we can find some roundabout ways to figure out who they are. So if something happened somewhere, there might be video recording in a store, so we may be able to use that. We may be able to find that child's name in our system already and be able to link them to a parent. So even if you know the child's name and you think mom's name is Sarah, and that's all you have, that's fine. Give them all the information that you have. And let them know when it happened when you call. Let them know, did this happen yesterday? Did this happen 3 weeks ago? Did this happen 2 years ago? You can call it in at any time. I would prefer that you call it in right away because then we can actually do something about it, hopefully. But it doesn't mean that if you find out something that happened 2 years ago that you don't have to call it in or you don't want to. Still call it in. It may be information that we needed on another. We may already have an investigation with that family. We may have had 20 calls about something, but the piece of information you share with us might be the one piece that we needed. So don't hesitate to call at any time. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about our guidelines as to what constitutes abuse and neglect, but just briefly want to share with you that we do have legal guidelines. That's confusing to people a lot of times because people will become frustrated about why we didn't do something, why we're not assigning something for investigation, or why we did not substantiate any type of abuse or neglect. There are legal guidelines that we have to follow. Some of the things that we hear most often are they're spanking their child, or they're spanking their child with a belt, or a paddle, or a cord, or any other multiple things that people like to use. You are allowed to physically discipline your children in the state of Michigan. That's the law. You are also allowed to physically discipline your children with an implement. You can use a belt. You can use a paddle. You can use a switch. I am not by any means condoning or encouraging any of these things, but this is what our law does say. What you can't do is harm or injure the child, which means you can't leave a mark on them or use excessive force when doing this. So that makes our job much more difficult because we have to walk the line between what is harm or injury. Is it just a mark? Is it fear in a child? Is it anxiety that may produce in a child? So there's a lot more that goes into how we make decisions than just did they strike them or did they not? Because they're allowed to do that in some cases. The other thing with neglect is that we talked a little bit about some of the social issues behind that. We cannot substantiate somebody for neglect due to poverty, which makes that also really difficult for us. So if they are don't have a lot of food in their home or their power is shut off, we don't have the option to say, well, you're being neglectful to your child. We will work with them to try to alleviate those situations and fix it and put some services in to help them, but we can't necessarily say they're being neglectful just because they don't have the money to actually do what they want to be able to do for their children. So there are some gray areas. Really, the entire field of child welfare is very gray. So it takes a lot of insight and a lot of decision making and a lot of conferencing to determine how to handle these cases. So just be aware of that. If you call something in or you're talking to someone and you don't understand why CPS did what they did, understand that we have a lot of guidelines and policies that we have to follow, and sometimes it ties our hands in situations. We have spoken numerous times in our office about having just a trust me on this one checkbox somewhere that we can say, we may not be able to show you on paper everything that you need to see to follow this legally, but just trust me on this one that something's not right in this house and we really want to go in there and help. So we don't have that option at this point yet. So that hinders us a little bit. What happens once you call into CPS? The intake workers make a decision on whether your case, that complaint gets assigned for an investigation or not. If it does not, sometimes nothing happens to it. It just gets filed as it didn't meet the criteria to be investigated. Sometimes it's screened out to another agency that's more appropriate. Law enforcement, there's some situations we can't handle, but law enforcement does. Or a foster home licensing situation. So it may be screened out to one of those agencies. If it's assigned for an investigation, it will be assigned to a worker in whatever county. They go out, they complete their investigation. They have 30 days to do that. They make a decision after that, at that point, at any point during those 30 days, whether there is substantiated abuse or neglect. If we substantiate abuse or neglect, we do not automatically remove the children. That kind of goes along the line with some of the myths that are out there. We are not baby snatchers. We do not get a bonus for the number of children that we remove. We don't have a quota of the number of children that we have to remove. We try very hard not to remove any children if we have any other option. So if we do substantiate, our first job is to try to put some type of service in the home to protect the children and to reduce the amount of risk in the home. We can't even go to court unless we can show that we have taken those steps, made some reasonable efforts to prevent a removal. So we have to do that up front, and we have to be able to make that statement to a judge in court. Not every case goes to court. We can put services in, work with a family, reduce the risk, and we close our case, and that's it. It never goes to court. If we can't reduce the risk or the risk increases in the home, we may go to court and ask just that the court oversee the services that are in the home. So we still aren't removing the children. We're just asking for a more supportive oversight of the family, a little more oomph behind what we're asking them to do, somebody else to hold them accountable to that. If those things still don't work, that's when we're going to start looking at removal of the children if we have no other options. And even at that point when we reach removal, we're immediately looking at any non-custodial parents, any relatives, family members that we can place this child with before we would ever consider placing them in foster care. So there are a lot of steps before a child actually would reach the foster care system. whenever we have the opportunity to do that. Some situations there is too much immediate risk to wait, so we don't have that option. So that's kind of what happens to cases once they come in to the CPS system, how they end up getting out of the CPS system. The most important thing for you all to take away with you today is just call. Don't ever feel like you can't. Don't ever feel like you're not sure whether it's abuse or neglect. That's not your job. It's our job to determine whether it is or not. If you're not sure, you don't know if it would qualify for investigation or not, just call. You can always call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They are sitting at intake waiting for your call. So thank you all for coming, and I will be happy to answer any of your questions when we're done.
Hi, my name is Jeff Kelsch. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Beyer-Walter for inviting me to be part of the panel. As she said, I'm an adjunct faculty here at GRCC. I see a few familiar faces. But for my day job, I work as a licensed psychologist in private practice downtown here at a firm called Human Resource Associates. And I've been there for almost 11 years. Prior to going into private practice, I worked as a prison psychologist for 7 years. So child abuse and neglect is something, and child maltreatment is something that I've dealt with for most of my career. Sort of working with perpetrators, working with the victims, working with adults who had been victims of child maltreatment. Part of my practice nowadays is I conduct psychological evaluations that are termed capacity to parent evaluations or parenting fitness evaluations for people who have been involved and referred by Child Protective Services. I sort of went through the numbers and I calculated that probably over the past 10, 11 years, I've probably evaluated almost 2,500 people who've had substantiated complaints of neglect or abuse. Occasionally, well, more than occasionally, I'll also see the children who have been involved in the case, and there's allegations that they've been abused or neglected as well. I also frequently testify in court on these matters. Most often it'll be when the case has gone through the child welfare system, is now very involved in the legal system, and there's a petition to terminate someone's parental rights. And I'll be called in to testify in court as an expert witness. I also do a fair amount of work in training people who will work in child welfare. I do some clinical supervision with psychologists and counselors who work with these issues, and I'll also do a fair amount of consulting in cases where there are issues of child maltreatment or abuse or neglect. My task today was to talk about the long-term consequences of abuse and neglect, to describe the perpetrators of abuse and neglect, and to describe some risk factors that are associated with child maltreatment. In order to sort of get a handle on what I'm going to try to talk about today, well, let me back up. One thing that those are my tasks. What my sort of goal is today is to try to integrate some of the research on child maltreatment into some of the observations that I've seen in my work over the past 10 years. So you'll get kind of a combination of the research literature plus some anecdotal observations that I've seen working with these issues for many years. But in order to try to get an understanding of child maltreatment, it's important to really kind of understand there are basically 4 types of abuse. You already know physical abuse and sexual abuse, like Dr. DeYoung had talked about, is probably the sort of, I don't want to say most popular, but the most well-known. Emotional abuse is also quite salient as well, and we're talking about verbal abuse. And emotional abuse can take the form of calling the child names, making disparaging and derogatory statements toward the child. But also there are, and I know some of these things can sound a bit disturbing, and when you work in this every day, you become a bit desensitized. So I'll apologize up front if I sound a little blunt and insensitive, but there are other things like psychological torture that occasionally occurs. I'll try to use a mild example. I've had many cases where a parent has told the child that they will kill themselves, and did various gestures to cause emotional turmoil in the child. There's also, you'll see things like torturing or killing a child's pet. These are forms of emotional abuse, okay? Neglect. I like what Dr. DeYoung said about neglect is neglected. Neglect is also a very important component in child maltreatment. I already mentioned you have medical neglect, not taking your child to the doctor when they have physical problems, not feeding your child. There's also, I would argue, some emotional neglect, not being there for the child in order to help them navigate certain developmental issues that they have to navigate, not supporting peer relationships, things like that. So neglect can also be quite, can have quite an impact, and it is often a component of child maltreatment that we don't talk that much about. Now, for my first task, to talk about the long-term consequences of neglect and abuse, some of the things I'm going to mention today will not be surprising. But it's also important to know that just being subjected to child maltreatment or being sexually abused as a child or being physically abused as a child does not guarantee that you'll have these problems, all right? I will run through the common problems that are associated, and if you've all taken PY 201, and especially if you've taken my class, you know this issue about correlation versus causation. Just because it's associated doesn't mean it causes it, right? I think we all teach that, don't we? Okay. Depression. In the research, there's a lot of research to support the idea that child maltreatment is associated with development of depression later in life. The strongest association or correlation that you'll see is with sexual and emotional abuse, okay? There's also obviously a strong association with physical abuse as well. So depression is not uncommon for folks who have been abused as a child. Anxiety is another very common clinical problem that you'll see that develops in a person who's been subjected to abuse or neglect. There are other psychiatric disorders. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is not uncommon for folks who have been abused or mistreated as a child. That's an anxiety disorder. You've probably heard of the notion of people having flashbacks to their abuse, sort of reliving abuse that occurred in their childhood. That's not entirely uncommon with folks who have been subjected to abuse. Now, just because you've been abused or mistreated as a child does not mean you're going to develop PTSD, but it's not uncommon. Substance abuse. Substance abuse is another thing that's highly correlated or associated with people who have been abused as a child. Now, it's also important to understand these sort of consequences that are clinical problems that I'm telling you. There's an interaction that occurs. And what I mean by that is sometimes if people are having trouble coping with emotional turmoil due to their recollections of abuse or mistreatment as a child, they may turn to substances, right? So substances may be used to cope with the emotional turmoil. So these things interact. They're not mutually exclusive. Cognitive development problems are associated with child abuse, particularly if abuse is occurred with younger children. I think many of you probably heard of shaken baby syndrome, which is a form of abuse where an infant, the parent has a hard time with making the infant stop crying and will shake the child. Okay, I think that's pretty well known. Antisocial behavior and anger problems is something you'll see in the literature that's strongly associated with individuals who have been mistreated as a child. Violent behavior, domestic violence, there seems to be a pattern that if you grew up in a home where you were abused and other people in the home were abused, like the parents were physically assaultive to each other, that it's not uncommon but not guaranteed that sometimes it'll carry over and become sort of almost normal or typical in that sort of culture of that family. And Jen talked a little bit about they may not even think that what's happening to them is entirely wrong or outside the ordinary. When I was preparing for this today, one thing that I didn't really realize, but I found when I looked at the literature, was physical health problems are also strongly associated with a history of child abuse or maltreatment. There's actually a couple of studies that talk about children who sustain rib fractures from childhood abuse are at a much higher risk for bone cancer. I mean, life expectancy is lower for populations that have endured physical abuse. Now, with all of that being said, it's also important to understand there's also a body of literature that looks at children who have been in abusive situations or mistreated and have not developed any of these clinical conditions or problems. The research terms these children dandelion children, which I think is an interesting phrase, was the idea that dandelions can pretty much flourish and develop and do well any place, right? Cracks in the sidewalk, there are dandelions out. So this moves into an area of the literature, research literature called resilience. And in my practice, one thing that has always surprised me over the years is I will see 4 children in a family and they all sustain sort of similar abuse. One of the kids sort of takes the PTSD route. They start to develop anxiety. One of the kids takes the antisocial route, starts acting out at school. One takes the depression route, starts to develop depression, and the other one is fine. And so the resilience research is trying to look at why that occurs. Now, one of my other tasks is to describe the risk factors associated with child maltreatment. This is very tricky because what you would maybe expect is I would put a list up and say these are the factors that are associated with a risk for child maltreatment. In forensic psychology, which is the interaction of the legal system and psychology, we do things like I do risk for violence assessments. And the research fits pretty well with what's called a linear model. So if there are 20 factors associated with risk for violence and you have 9 of those, you're at a higher risk. That's kind of a linear model. In child maltreatment, the linear model has not held up. It's also dangerous for me to put up a list of characteristics and say these are associated, because if you look at someone you know and say, well, that person's got 5 of those, that child must be at risk. So this approach to a linear model is not, it's supported in the research. But what the research says is that certain factors, and these factors can be sociological, personal or individual differences, for example, substance abuse in a parent. Some of these factors together can set up conditions where abuse can occur. So from a scientific standpoint or an empirical approach, you really can't make a determination of risk for child abuse. But what you can do is examine certain factors that are present that could allow for the conditions for child abuse to occur. Okay? So one thing to understand if you think about the 4 types of child abuse is child maltreatment is a very complicated issue. Okay? And it's not something that is easy to put into kind of the linear models that we would like. So they talk about these factors as setting up a process or a condition where child abuse can occur. Now, another thing that I've been charged with was to talk about the perpetrators of abuse and neglect. And I can tell you the research would say, and in my practice, I've seen folks who've abused or neglected or mistreated their children from all walks of life. I've seen doctors, lawyers, pastors. I've seen pastors doing prison sentences for their abuse they did on children. I've seen homeless people. I've seen working class people. I've seen mentally ill people. So it runs the gamut. There's not a particular type of person who is inclined to abuse their children. Right? Now, we could put up a list of, well, these are characteristics you often see in abusers, but really if we take the idea that we can't sort of hammer these factors into a linear approach, you have to understand that all types of folks are involved in child maltreatment, okay? Now, what I'll see in my practice many times is a truncated sample. In other words, I'll see the folks who have been discovered by Child Protective Services. Occasionally I see the folks who are not. What I'll see, now again, I want you to take this list I'm going to give you and not say that this is a risk factor, but this is what I see locally in this truncated sample. We'll see a high degree of substance abuse in the parents. That's pretty common in the type of work that we'll do. Oftentimes, we'll see a lower economic status, socioeconomic status. It doesn't mean if you don't have a lot of money and a lot of education, you're not going to abuse, but that's more commonly what comes into our office. Frequently, we'll see sort of single-parent households with many different partners coming through, different boyfriends and girlfriends that come through. Very common for us to see on these CPS referrals young parents with multiple children from multiple uninvolved fathers. There are many cases where parents will have multiple children with multiple uninvolved fathers and abuse does not occur, right? But that's something that we see more frequently. A lack of parental supervision or engagement is something we see a lot, particularly in sex abuse cases. A lack of child development, knowledge of parenting techniques. That's something we'll see frequently. By the way, that's something that's very fixable, right? With services that get in place like parenting education. And occasionally we'll see untreated mental illness, but not very often. I was talking with a colleague about this yesterday. One of the myths would be that someone is sick or someone has a mental disorder when they do this. Occasionally you see someone with untreated mental illness who's involved in child maltreatment, but most of the time that's not the issue. And most of the time we'll see folks with mental illness that is treated and adequately treated, but still some child maltreatment occurs. So to not confuse you any, I just want to sort of emphasize the point that child maltreatment is a complicated issue. If you look at the different types of abuse that commonly occur that we see. Trying to determine which risk factors are associated with abuse is important work, but it's also important to not list risk factors with the assumption that we can apply these towards sort of a risk analysis of an individual. Now, identifying risk factors can be important because then we can try to design intervention or social service programs to mitigate some of those issues or alleviate those. But there's not a particular cluster of risk factors that is predictive of abuse. And thirdly, the idea of who does the abuse or who's involved in child maltreatment. It occurs across a broad spectrum of people, socioeconomic status, racial identities or ethnicities. It occurs in all types of houses. Who comes to Child Protective Services is, I would argue, sort of a truncated sample. And I will see certain characteristics that tend to be fairly common in the cases that I see through Child Protective Services and the children are removed from the home. But that doesn't really tell the whole picture. So child abuse and child maltreatment, child abuse and neglect is something that occurs everywhere, okay, not just with particular types of folks and particular types of situations.
This is Jodeci. Hello. And she is part of our Healthy Start program at Family Futures. So, Jodeci, tell us how you got started with Healthy Start. What made you interested in being a part of our program?
Well, I was 15 and pregnant, and I needed a helping hand. I needed support. I didn't have much at home, so I went to the Pregnancy Resource Center and got the information for Healthy Start, and I signed it, sent it in the mail, and they got back to me.
And what kind of support has been provided to you as a new mom?
By being there for me, where I could talk about anything I needed to. They taught me patience, how to understand my son and why he does the things that he does.
Because he's now 2.
He's 2. Yeah, he's 2 now. Esther, my worker, actually, she even helped me get a safer crib for him. The first crib we had was, can't even think about it, but she got me a safer crib and a car seat. And I don't know where I would be if I didn't have her.
And how has Healthy Start then helped you become a better parent?
Well, I learned that when my son acts up, that he's just curious instead of bad. He's just curious. I had baby experience before, but having my own child, I guess I didn't have as much experience. So, so Esther, she helped me learn how to understand him better. My mom and dad really didn't support me, but Esther supported me a lot. I'm sorry, I call my son Puda, so Puda's written on this paper. I really want Puda to have a better future, and Esther helps me see how I can do that.
Because having a baby changes everything.
Everything,
Yeah.
everything.
And so how has he been able to grow as part of Healthy Start?
Like Michelle said in the video, Poodle was delayed in his development too. So Esther, she gave me the kind of like connections. We filled out the questionnaires, the ages and stages questionnaires, and she gave me the materials I needed to help him with the development, and we practiced that 2 or 3 times a day. And now he's caught up in the development. He's all over the place.
And how do you think that your life would be different if you hadn't been a part of Healthy Start?
I would have been lost. I may have acted like I knew what I was doing, but things would have been more difficult. Healthy Starts has taught me how to be the best mom I can be.
Well, thank you so
All right.
much.
Thank you.
I feel lucky to follow that video. My name is Sue Toman. Brandy is on my staff. I wanted to say this, and it's presumptuous, but it's true. They save the best for last. That is not tooting my own horn at all, but this is Child Prevention of Abuse Month, not Abuse Month or Neglect Month. And so we've heard a lot about neglect, we've heard a lot about abuse, but you haven't heard very much about prevention. And that's what this month is celebrating and recognizing. We have something going on at our church that's a little funny to me, and I'm not really like the rah-rah kind of lady, but some people go to our church who need rides, and they were really, the person who was trying to get rides for these folks to get to church said, out of a congregation of 500, we've had 3 people volunteer to get 25 people to church, and he was appalled by that. So what I'm excited about when I'm looking at this audience is that, to me, just like there should have been a lot more people at church raising their hands and saying, we'll give rides. So he started saying this team, and then the whole congregation had to say mobilize, and the idea was that we were all to be responsible for each other and helping each other meet each other's needs. And so what I want to start out my presentation is saying, we all have potential to abuse and neglect people around us, whether they're our biological children or not, because we all have a tendency to not live perfectly. So we can mobilize by taking responsibility for our own parenting and our own relationships, but the other way that you can mobilize is that we're a community, and those cliches that happen, like it takes a village to raise a child, we want them to be true, and we want to all help each other to be the best parents. So that's why I'm excited by this video that you just saw, because Jodeci would fit many of those risk factors that Jeff didn't really want to list, but she was a teen parent, she didn't have the support of her parents, she hadn't finished high school yet. She had all kinds of risk factors, but there's nobody who can watch that video that does not see how incredible her love is for her child, how invested she is in becoming the best parent she can be. And so when I think about prevention and why I'm involved in it, it's born of a belief that I can't say 100% of parents, but the vast majority of parents want to be the best parent that they can be. So you really, right away, you have a way to engage parents and to give them feedback about their parenting when you see it, because if you can have that be the bridge you start on, that people want to be the best parent that they can be, lots of good conversations can occur in this community that will lead toward children developing well. So there's lots of risk factors, but research promotes that there are also a lot of protective factors that can be built into family life. And the more protective factors that parents and families have, that lowers the risk of abuse and neglect, but it also increases optimal child development. So I'm going to talk to you about what the protective factors are that research has found that is effective in helping to prevent child abuse and neglect, and on the flip side, promoting positive development of children. And they're well established, like I said, but the part that's interesting to me is when I say them, they're not mysterious, and you'll kind of have this, well, she's just talking common sense at me. Well, when I was in high school, I had a friend who'd always say, the problem with common sense is that it isn't common. Well, the other problem is that sometimes common sense solutions are hard to apply. And so these won't be like, you won't go away from here and saying, oh, that last one was the best because she told me things I didn't know. I'm going to tell you lots of things that you already know that make sense. But the fun part is to play around with the concepts, the protective factors, and say, How do I promote these in my own life? How do I promote these in the families that are near and dear to me? I mean, I think about this with my own family. I think about it with the families that Family Futures works with. So they'll seem intuitive. The first one is parental resilience. Jeff talked about that child that's like the dandelion that won't die no matter how much weed killer you put on it, which is true in my yard. So there are parents also, we need to develop that in parents, the ability to bounce back from challenges. And the part that's helpful to me is that when you come from a middle class background, you have one sort of challenges. When you come from a wealthy background, you have another set of challenges. And when you come from poverty, you have a different set of challenges. Life is full of challenges, no matter what economic. I mean, Romney's trying really hard to prove that he's one of us and that he has faced challenges. And there are challenges no matter what sphere you live in. But the key to life is the ability to bounce back. And so there's another group that deals with protective factors, and they summarize the parental resilience as be strong, but be flexible. And so we want to encourage parents to have confidence that they can do it. I can't imagine what it must have been like when the doctor came to Jodeci and said, "You're pregnant." I mean, what a time to feel like, well, I can't do that. And yet, parents that become good parents, like she obviously is, they're strong and they dig deep inside themselves and figure out how they're going to do it. Second, develop social connections. And that's been translated to parents need friends. Often when I talk to our interns about protective factors, I say, if you have a big test coming this week and you're fretting about it because you've gotten 3 C's and you want to pull your grade up to a B and you need to get an A on this test to do it, it's the final. You get an A, you'll get a B in the class, and that's really important to you. You can feel overwhelmed, but if you have some cheerleading friends around you who say, yeah, you really can find 20 minutes to study here, 20 minutes to study there, I can share my notes with you, that's going to help you. That's the kind of things that build social connections and help you to be able to parent better. It's just a different topic than school. Knowledge of parenting and child development, it's proven that if you know what to expect from your child, you're less likely to abuse and neglect them. And that's the statement that's been changed to being is that being a parent is part natural and part learned. And isn't that the truth? That you have some instincts about how to parent, but you got to learn some stuff too. So when I was a probation officer here in Kent County, I used to have 2-year-olds come and their parent would say that they needed to sit still in the chair while they talked to me for a half an hour. No 2-year-old sits still, and they would say, kind of what she said, she learned her child wasn't bad. They'd say, oh, my child's so bad. No, your child's not bad, they're 2. And so it helps when you learn those things. The fourth one is concrete support in time of need, and that's been translated to we all need help sometimes. If you wake up for work and your child's really, really sick and you need to go and get that paycheck, if you have 3 friends you can call and say, who can take my child and watch him today because they're too sick to go to daycare? That's concrete support in time of need. You're out of food and you know where the food pantry is in your neighborhood and you can go there and get food. That's concrete support in time of need. And we need to help people find the concrete support they need. And then as I was talking about mobilizing youth, sometimes we need to be the concrete support for the families we know that are living in challenging situations. The fifth one is social and emotional competence in children. Parents need to help their children learn how to be socially and emotionally competent. It helps protect children from abuse and neglect. I wanted to make sure that, especially when I was building emotional and social competence, that I taught my children boundaries so that they knew that another kid going off and slugging him in the playground crossed a boundary. They knew adults doing certain things to them crossed boundaries, and they had the wherewithal inside themselves to say, stop it, that's not okay with me. Then the last protective factor is to promote healthy parent-child relationships, and that's been translated to give your child love and respect. So there's a lot that you can do to prevent child abuse and neglect, and I feel like if we mobilize the community to understand what protective factors are and how we can help build them in our own lives and in our community, it's really true that many of us will become good enough parents, not perfect parents, but we'll have good enough parents, and we'll have children that aren't abused and neglected and are able to thrive and to grow. So thanks, that's the end of my part, and I'm going to turn it over to Kate.
Okay, thank you so much, panel. I really appreciate it. I'm going to ask that you just keep the microphone there, and we do have a little bit of time. We've saved some time for questions, and so I will come around to you with a microphone. I know it's hard to be the first person to ask a question, but
my question is for Jen. I was wondering, is there do you think being a social worker is emotionally difficult? And do you have any advice for somebody that might be interested in going into it?
Sure. Social work is definitely an emotionally difficult field. We actually spend a lot of time working with our staff on secondary trauma that they suffer as a result of some of the things that they see and deal with on a daily basis. So in this field of CPS, it's especially difficult, but in all the fields, I think it's always difficult. Anytime that you're dealing with a family in need or even an individual in need, your first instinct is to help them, to do for them. And you have to build boundaries to prevent yourself from doing that. So really, I think my advice would be similar to some of the protective factors that we've talked about with children are really the same protective factors we use for ourselves as social workers. Build a support system, set boundaries that are clear. We want to work 24/7 because we know what's out there, but we can't. You need to stop. At certain times, you just need to stop. And you need to go home, be with your family, do things you enjoy, find some ways to release some of the tension and anxiety. We have exercise programs in our office a few times a week so that people can try to find some outlets for that, because there's a lot of that builds up, and a lot of our families don't really want to hear about it all the time. They don't understand it necessarily. We're very fortunate when they do, but they don't need to hear the nitty-gritty, and it's very hard to explain to them what you've seen when you have had a day where you've been at the hospital with a shaken baby and seen the impact of that and see this tiny infant in this giant hospital bed is very traumatic, and they don't always want to hear it. So using your coworkers, other professionals in your field as your support system can be really helpful.
Mine's more a two-part question, sort of. What is the prevalence of more than What is the prevalence of more than one form of abuse in individual cases, and what are some of the available options for breaking the cycle for the people who have been abused to prevent them from being abusers themselves?
I'll answer that the best I can. If anyone has any input, they can chime in. It is not uncommon for us to see multiple factors in a home, multiple types of abuse in a home. Not always, by any means. There are certain ones that tend to go together more. More so, I guess, than others, I would say. I'm trying to think of what we see the most combined. We would a lot of times see neglect, and we see a lot of neglect and physical abuse together. A lot of that, I think, stems from some of the socioeconomic factors that lead to the neglect, causes a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of frustration in the home that gets released somewhere. A lot of times parents lose their temper, and that's when we see shaken babies, or we see a handprint on a child's face, or we see, they spanked them a little too hard that day because it had been a really bad day. Not every case of abuse is somebody who just beats their child all the time, but sometimes they just lose it for a minute, and it may be just that single incident, but a lot of times we see those two things paired together.
I'll see a lot of emotional and physical abuse paired together. That's pretty common. But I think that's probably the most common that I see. But what's important is that these types of abuse. I like the bigger term of child maltreatment, because sometimes you'll see situations where there'll be emotional abuse. It'll start out and then it'll move into physical. Sometimes it's just physical. Sometimes it's just sexual. So there can be different types, but I like the bigger umbrella term of child maltreatment. It makes more sense.
The other part was breaking the cycle, and I think that's very possible for the cycle to be broken. I think that it depends a bit about what the abuse or neglect was in terms of how to break that cycle. Part of it is building those protective factors, and that can happen through having a case manager. I think that Jeff has done a lot of therapy. I'm sure that he has seen counseling be key, because lots of times, even in minor ways, you repeat how you've been parented. And so part of it is to look at how you've been parented and sort of come to grips with it, come to acceptance, and then to be able to have support to change that. And I don't know if you want to talk about that, because you've done that counseling.
One thing that I'll see that we haven't talked about today is that's fairly common in the cases that I'll see. And again, I see the cases that are sort of truncated down. They've been through CPS. It's not uncommon for us to see, for example, a single mother who has a boyfriend that moves into the house, and the boyfriend's abusive to everybody in the house. And then there's a petition for failure to protect. The accusation is that mother didn't adequately protect. And a lot of the folks that I'll see when I do their psychological evaluations, I'll find they have things like dependent personality disorder, or dependent personality characteristics. They don't have a healthy ability to be assertive in their relationships. So one thing that we'll do is refer the person for counseling, and part of the prescription of the counseling is to help with their interpersonal assertiveness, to help them gain some insight into the choices they're making in their personal relationships. Sometimes we'll see, we'll make referrals for domestic violence counseling. So that's something we haven't talked about, but having a boyfriend typically, or sometimes a girlfriend in the house that's abusive to the children, and then the parents not putting forth an adequate ability to parent, is not uncommon. And sometimes the counseling can help them make better choices in their relationships, and recognize boundaries. If you meet someone and you've been, going out with them for 2 weeks, it's not necessarily healthy or appropriate to let them move into your house and parent your children, and then your children call them dad. I mean, that sounds ridiculous, but I've seen that quite a bit.
Other questions?
I used to work at John Ball Zoo, and one day when I was there, 2 guys came in with someone I'd assumed was their son or related to them somehow. The boy was about 2, and he was wearing one of those backpacks with a long tail on it so kids can, or parents keep a leash on their kids. I don't particularly like those, but at one point the boy was crying and lying on the ground, and I didn't see why he was, and the guy that was holding onto the end of the tail of the monkey thing was trying to pick him up with the tail, and he wouldn't bend down to pick his kid up, and the kid just wouldn't stop crying, and he wasn't even looking at his child. I'm assuming it was his child, but I didn't know what to do about it, and I didn't know if that was abuse or if that was neglect, and there was really nobody I could ask about that.
Those are probably the most difficult situations that we deal with, when you don't necessarily see, and you're seeing a very isolated situation. You don't always know what the circumstances were that were leading to it, and you don't know them. So it's hard to call CPS and say, well, I saw this happen at the zoo, and I don't know who they are. I don't know where they live. I don't know any of their names. You can call. We're not going to be able to do anything because we don't know who they are. What I would recommend, though, is if you're seeing something and you really feel like that child's at risk, before you call us, call the police, because that is their job, and first and foremost. They can be there faster. If there's an imminent risk to a child, if you're in Meyer and someone is just whooping the snot out of their kid and you're like, holy cow, that is not going to end well, don't wait to call us and have us go out tomorrow. Call the police now and have them come. Now, if you're seeing a mom just, frustrated and yelling at her kid, I'm not recommending that you call the police because she's yelling at her child, but there are some other avenues. Sometimes there is no good answer for those situations because you don't know. I can't even answer you whether it was abuse or neglect without knowing more or having a more detailed description. So, having you guys try to rely on what is or isn't is always really difficult, but those are the situations where I said just call. Let us make that decision as to whether it's something that qualifies or not. If it makes you uncomfortable, that's usually the time when you want to call. It may not meet any legal standards, that's fine, but next time it might, and next time when someone calls, we're going to pull that up and see that you had called before and had a concern about it. That's going to increase how we look at it. It's going to change how we look at it because we're going to see that there were other complaints before that. So I don't know if that answered your question. That's a tough question, but there isn't really a good answer for it.
Thank you. Other questions? Put your hand up high so I can see you. Thank you.
If I were to call in to report something, does the person I'm reporting, would they ever find out who it is? Is that required? For example, if it's a family member or something and you don't want to lose contact with the rest of the family, how does that all work?
I'm really glad that you asked that because I meant to cover that in my presentation earlier, but there's so much to cover in 15 minutes. So no, we are not allowed to disclose that information by law to anybody unless a court orders us to, and in my experience, I have never heard a court order anybody to do that. And it would have to be a very special circumstance where a court would order that. So we have people ask us all the time, especially when we show up at their door and say CPS was called. They are so completely focused on who called, and that is all they want to know. And we tell them over and over again that we are not allowed to disclose that by law. They will trick you, though, so be aware of this, because they will tell you that we told them, and we did not. But they will bluff you into admitting that you called. They are very smart. So please be aware, we cannot under any circumstances disclose who called. There are times when they're going to figure it out because of the information that was given, they may know. We try to be very careful in training our intake staff to write the allegations in a way that does not disclose who called, including not even writing he or she. We refer to people as the referent in there. Sometimes the circumstance or the situation may give away who called, so we try to leave that information out in any part that a parent may see. They're allowed to see the allegation that was made against them. They're allowed to have a copy of their report, so they'll see that. So we go to great lengths to try to protect that person's identity in all of our documentation as well as in our investigations. That's a good question. Thank you.
We have time for a few more.
We have one up here in the front.
Thank you.
Hi, this question is for Jeff. And one of my coworkers, she have a unique way to raise her kid. She kind of brainwashed them into believing that everybody is bad outside of the house. And I was wondering, is this like an emotional abuse, and what long-term effect on them?
Okay, well, another great question. It is a form. It could be considered a form of emotional abuse. Now, when you use the phrase an unusual or a different approach to parenting, sometimes in my job I'll be charged with the idea: is this an unusual way to parent? Number one, and number two, does this cause any type of emotional damage? In the law, they talk about a thing called mental injury. So in cases like that, if a parent is using an approach that maybe isn't mainstream or typical, a lot of times I'll be charged with making a determination on whether or not this is causing some level of emotional damage. Now, something like brainwashing your children to tell them that everyone outside the family is bad is obviously not a usual or typical parenting technique. It could result in some level of emotional confusion and discomfort in the children, right? Depends on the child's age. It could. Now, under the law, mental injury the law is not very well written for that particular concept. But what I typically do is I'll say, is there emotional turmoil being caused by this parenting behavior? And sometimes the parenting behaviors are tricky. Breastfeeding your 6-year-old. Is that typical? Is that causing emotional damage? Taking your children to a nudist camp. These are cases I've had. I've had a few of the nudist camp cases. Is this unusual to have family outings to the nudist camp? And does this cause any type of emotional damage? I mean, some of them are tricky questions. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you.
is there any way if somebody gets an allegation against them where it's, I guess, I don't know if you would say somewhat proven, and they move to another state and it happens again, does that state know that it happened in another state?
We do have, I can't answer to how other states handle this, but I can answer to how Michigan handles this. We do have legislation here that requires us to contact another state if a parent tells us they have lived in another state. So we're somewhat dependent on what they share with us, which is also a testament to our skills to be able to engage families to get them to share a lot of this information with us. But if they tell us that their family has lived in Ohio, Illinois, Texas, and Rhode Island as an adult while their children have been born, we are required to contact all of those Children Protective Services in all those states to determine whether they have any history there, and we would get copies of those reports. We have a new system that will be implemented in the state, I don't even know, probably not until next year, at least sometime, a new computer system. That system is actually supposed to become a nationwide system, so we would actually be able to have computer access directly to other states. That would be a huge benefit, because we do have situations where we find out after the fact that they've had children removed in another state or had their rights terminated in another state. I find it ironic that they share this with us on a regular basis, because a lot of times they do, and I appreciate that, but we don't have any way to know if they don't, because we obviously cannot contact all other 49 states, but we do try to get that information.
This one's probably more for Jeff. If you know someone that was abused like as a child and they're probably like 21 and they're trying to recover now, is there anything you can do to help? If so, what can you do to help them?
What do you do as a friend, you mean? Or just in general, what can happen clinically, or both? I don't know.
Both.
Okay. Well, if you have a friend who is 21 and has experienced abuse as a child and is having some emotional difficulty, obviously counseling is the one thing that can really make a big impact. Now, as a friend, what do you do? Well, the best thing you can probably do is listen, even if it's difficult to listen. It's also important to try to emphasize that, the abuse happened in the past, but you're safe now, and those are kind of standard sort of clinical interventions that are emphasized in counseling folks who have had experiences of abuse in childhood. But I would say as a friend, probably just listening and being there for them, not trying to solve the problem for them, but just letting them vent to you. And then again, counseling with a licensed therapist or counselor is probably the best approach.
My question was, if you had a family member that is neglecting your child, is it your responsibility to intervene right then and there, or call CPS, because you won't want your family member, especially like a niece or a nephew, be taken away? What do you recommend for that purpose?
If it's something that's happening right in front of your face, obviously we want to all protect the children, so that would be our first instinct, but you need to be careful of that yourself, because we don't want to put you at risk either. So yes, you can address it right there at the time. What I would say is that you don't, even though it's a family member, you don't always know everything that's going on, nor do you want your role to be the CPS worker in the family, because that really hinders your ability to be an aunt or a cousin or a sister. So I would recommend that you call. I know it's difficult. Nobody wants their family members removed. And that's why I wanted to share with you guys earlier that that is not the most prevalent thing that we do. As a matter of fact, we just got our statistics from last month, and for the team that I supervise, we did no removals last month. None. So that's not uncommon. If I saw a number for my staff that was even 5 in a month, I would probably be surprised if it was not a sibling group of 5 where we had removed on one family. So we are not removing kids all the time. So this may, by letting CPS know what's going on, more likely than not, it's going to provide services and support to the family that they may not either have elsewhere or be willing to accept, because they aren't always going to listen to their own family members, but sometimes when a neutral party comes in from outside, they're more willing to listen and recognize that there are some things that they could be doing differently.
I wanted to let you know, it's not your job ever to decide if somebody's neglected or abused their children, but you don't have to wait until it's not gray any longer and you know that somebody's abused or neglected their kids to make calls for help. There are prevention programs in Kent County. If you don't know what they are, you can call our office. And we have also, I think Mary has a copy, the Family Resource Guide. Do you have a copy of that? This guide, it has a vast array of resources that are available for families. Lots of them are free for families in Kent County. So there are a lot of resources out there, and it's really my hope that in terms of us doing prevention in the community, that you don't wait, and that families know they don't have to wait to have a CPS worker come to their door to deal with some issues that are troubling them. Lots of times they know some things are going on that they don't want to be going on, but they're afraid to call for help because they're afraid that that might lead to the removal of their child. And we want to encourage families to reach out for help, to be able to get, like Jodeci, she's not a PS client. She's just a young teen mom who knew that she needed some extra support and signed up for Healthy Start. And a home visitor comes to her home once a week and helps her learn about child development, and it's like a friend coming to your door. So there's lots of resources, and hopefully you can help the people around you not wait till it's at the point where it's a CPS issue, and we can, and lots of times CPS, when they go out and they say it's not to the level that it meets the law for abuse and neglect, they make the referral to the community resource to help the family. So they don't just say, well, let's wait till it gets so bad that it is CPS.
Wonderful. I think that's a good place for us to end. Thank you all so much. So round of applause, please. Thank you, and I will head to the back door with those slips that some of you need. Thank you.